I used to believe a day was honest if it resisted rehearsal. The morning a cup slid from my table, honesty met a loophole. Porcelain fractured into white petals, amber tea mapped itself across tile, and the air allowed a seam to open beneath my palm. Sound folded into a smaller version of itself, and the cup returned to the edge, as if memory could be made physical. My watch kept its hands pinned to 3, a small fracture catching the light. Outside, snow auditioned for spring and refused to step off stage. I stood inside the exact size of a miracle and tried to measure what it wanted from me. Practice began with clumsy arithmetic. Keys grazed the floor and reappeared in my fingers. Bus doors, known for impatience, developed a new talent for reconsidering. A coin rolled off its edge and learned humility. My palm found the same unseeable pressure point again and again, until the muscle knew it better than thought did. The city's texture softened. Lines shortened at my convenience. Elevators behaved as if their cables had read my mind. Crosswalks anticipated my foot. Smoothness spread until nothing had purchase. Memory slid off the day like water off lacquer. I learned that the 3-minute frame accepted gestures but rejected meaning. It welcomed the correction of clumsy hands, the rescue of slipping objects, the retiming of a step, the dodging of a low branch. It ignored decisions that required a season to ferment. It refused to rewrite promises or their failures. I could comb the surface of an hour until it gleamed and still remain unchanged beneath it, like a river stone made round by insistence but not warmed by purpose. At the railway crossing, iron and momentum placed me under oath. Flaking paint curled from a barrier that had forgotten authority. The bell let the wind play it without rhythm. A teenager pedaled toward the track with attention paid elsewhere. The rails sang a thin warning that lives give the wrong weight to. In 3 versions of the same sprint, I earned gravel in my knees, a grip on a backpack loop, and lungs filled with iron air. The freight train took the space where we had been. The boy rode away with a wobble, never turning his head. My hands shook with a mixture I could not label. Bodies can be counted. Meanings resist arithmetic. In a chalk-bright hall, I pared an exam down to a clean surface. Numbers aligned like soldiers pretending to be ideas. Punctuation fell in line. The page I turned in looked like success borrowed from someone else's life. Perfection obtained by edits refused to bruise. Without a bruise, belonging has nothing to anchor to. Lanterns gathered above the river and taught night to breathe from within. A girl with a red ribbon on her wrist lifted a frame of paper into warm air that preferred obedience. A bare branch tried to take that obedience away. My hand offered a cleaner arc. Her smile chose the sky. That was the correct geometry for strangers. I watched a second version, then a third, and felt repetition steal the first time's right to exist. I held still. The lantern joined a temporary constellation and disappeared the honorable way. By becoming too far away to name, hospitals bleached urgency into efficiency. White tiles turned footsteps into calendars. Rails remembered the weight of hands. My watch looked childish against the lighting. 3 minutes were coins I could spend only on small mercies. A glass caught at its tipping point. A blanket straightened before it could embarrass a nurse. An apple rescued from its orbit under a bed. Illness kept its own math and charged in units I did not own. In the elevator mirror, my eyes disputed each other's report. The trick acquired a sound in my head. 3 taps on cold glass. Insufficient to break anything, enough to measure resistance. Restraint failed in increments. I learned the taste of correction and wanted more of it. Shirts settled on shoulders with the confidence of tailoring I had not earned. Subway doors matched my stride, flattering me into believing choreography could be virtue. Rain paused on crosswalk lines without issuing credit. Taxis arrived, as if summoned by reputation. Reality thickened with alternatives. Memory filed multiple dawns, each sunbeam stopping at a slightly different point along the sill. Night delivered the same hallway dream. Repeat, reset, repeat, a corridor paved with my edits. Doors clicking obediently back to default. I woke with hairline cracks drawn fine as frost in the whites of my eyes, and rules written on the inside of my skull. The seam would serve life, or it would be left alone. A window on the 6th floor glowed red. Heat made the stairwell feel proximate to the sun. The first attempt brought a child to the street with a cough for a souvenir. The second remembered a wet cloth and a window that yielded when bullied sideways. The third met a ceiling beam that fell where it had not fallen before. Fire refused to be taught. Sirens braided sound into order. Neighbors counted windows that had ceased to contribute light. The child leaned against my jacket with the gravity of a small planet. Counting to 3 in my head felt like superstition again. The trick behaved like a seatbelt, not a philosophy. A kindness in a collision. I declared a moratorium that no one needed to hear. A bus left without me, and the empty interval stayed put, like a bruise that refused makeup. Pizza burned my tongue, and the sting was honest enough to be welcomed. I collected single-use moments with the respect usually reserved for heirlooms. The first beat of rain balanced on a knuckle. A crooked signature, submitted without revision. A scuff on the shin, paid to the tax authority of haste. Without interference, coincidence exhaled. A stranger caught a falling glass. A door opened on time without being asked. The world, relieved of management, made its own small generous decisions. An old clock shop held a neighborhood together by sound. Brass faces hung like coins on velvet. Pendulums rehearsed dignity. Second hands confessed how quickly loyalty can look like fuss. I bought nothing. I stood long enough for ticking to replace urgency with humility. The stopped hands on my wrist moved from taunt to scale. 3 was not authority. It was measurement. Storms learned the corners of the city by touch. Neon turned puddles into patient saints. A rooftop garden surrendered a plastic sheet to wind. A careless foot met a slick edge. My palm misbehaved before my mind finished prohibiting it. 3 minutes earlier, a wet footprint explained risk. I anchored a crate with my weight. The same step chose a new verb. The correction felt like a stolen pat on the head. Mercy and permission disagree. I recorded the disagreement in the only ledger that matters, the one written into habit. Days adapted without sulking. A scarf escaped on a bridge, and a gust returned it, without consulting me. At a cafe, friction rescued a glass from half a centimeter of disaster. I tried to live as if the seam were a chair left empty for a guest, not a throne. Self-control remained a kind of control, but one with less appetite. Trust requires an appetite for limits. I wrote a letter that postponement had colonized. Words arrived without theater, sober as a clerk. Ink smudged the heel of my hand and numbered me. Drafts gathered until they looked like a small city of crossed streets. I slid the envelope into the world and denied myself the sweetness of supervision. The purpose wasn't to be answered. The purpose was to stop expecting time to put on formal wear. Each time I hesitated. Morning put a palm against rooftops. Cicadas made a case for heat being a kind of music. I tied my shoes with attention I had previously wasted on ceremonies. I walked until the city conceded edge to grasses, and then to a shore, where stones celebrated roundness with the stubbornness of monks. Waves ran the same problem set, and refused to apologize for repetition. Clouds conferred about rain. I considered throwing my watch into the water, and judged the symbolism too easy. Keeping it would cost more. Work wanted competence, not narrative. Deadlines arranged themselves in sober rows. I submitted a report with a visible smudge only I would notice, and welcomed the service that flaw provides. An immaculate day, edited into compliance, misrepresented me. A day with fingerprints offered an honest signature. Panic disregarded etiquette and arrived unannounced. A child leaned over the lip of a platform with a curiosity that did not know trains by their real names. A cyclist and a car door flirted with disaster. A back under a heavy box pretended to be a lever. The seam opened for bodies, about to become the wrong kind of story. I used it without asking for gratitude. The way a city runs public transit, because need is dull and daily. Seatbelts do not deserve applause. The absence of catastrophe is applause enough. Seasons performed their rehearsal notes, and then their performances. Spring audited winter, and issued corrections in blossoms and mud. Typhoons read their lines from the horizon, and sometimes got the part. Heat took the lids off days, and poured them slowly. The cat that annexed my balcony insisted on rituals that acknowledged both food and dignity. Animals resist narrative, and have no interest in miracles not convertible into warmth or safety. I charted the topography of fatigue. Too many edits carve grooves in thought, where solutions drown. I wrote railings into habit. No rewinds for vanity. No rewinds for pride. No rewinds for convenience. Life, harm, kindness. The rest must stand. Railings ask to be leaned on, and sometimes break. I forgave myself with the same reluctance I granted others. Forgiveness loses value when automated. Memory drifted like fog across a field I had promised to mow. I kept a ledger under my breath. Days left unedited held weight. I could lift them without dizziness. They kept their failures and their tuition intact. Edited days felt light in the hand, disposable as receipts. I began to prefer the density of error that teaches by staying. The city offered a festival and then another, as if joy were an industry. Paperfish swam against blue. Drums enlisted ribs into percussion. Parades discovered corners I happened to be standing on. I learned to read abundance as hospitality, not as a dare. Not everything bright is better touched. Public restraint looks like patience. Patience teaches the world how to treat you. Grief arrived on a bench where I happened to be sitting. It wore a posture and a phone screen with no more work to do. The seam twitched with useless energy. 3 minutes could not build a bridge that should have taken a month. I chose the slower help of remaining. Not all help is motion. The clock shop went dark and remained dark. A street can lose a tooth and keep smiling, but eating becomes an effort. Habit brought me to a locked door for several days. I stood and listened to the sound that was not there anymore. Silence has a pitch, if you are willing to be tuned by it. The lesson did not congratulate itself. I visited a library to be near the kind of quiet that supports weight. Air held paper, and concentration the way hands hold a bowl. I traced a finger along spines and found an atlas that remembered a coastline no one asks to visit. The map honored coves, with no utility. Useless beauty is a permission slip. I folded the idea and carried it home. Rain turned windows into drums. Tape made crosses on panes, even though the physics of the gesture were mostly theater. Participation mattered. The storm passed whether or not my tape had improved anything. Residue remained and tolerated my patience with a scraper. Symbolic acts leave marks. The cleanup is part of the meaning. Winter established its government. Breath reclaimed visibility. Metal taught bare hands. The ethics of caution. Street corners rehearsed disagreements about pace. I put wool between bone and weather, and tried not to be proud of learning at last to collaborate with a season rather than edit. Yet gratitude grew better in shade than in noon. I thanked chairs for holding, bridges for pretending. Wait is pretend. Kettles for remembering to sing. I did it privately. The seam moved into a room at the back of the mind with conditions attached to its lease. It would wake for bodies, for harm, for kindness. It would sleep through vanity. It would not negotiate with pride. On a morning the color of a pearl, a child found balance on a bicycle at Riverside. Adult hands hovered and then retreated with practiced bravery. The wobble stabilized not because of intervention, but because bodies learn by paying tuition in scrapes. 3 minutes could have refunded the scrapes and stolen the lesson. I admired the price. I thought of the cup, the 3 heartbeats, the folding of sound, and the way a small miracle tried to grow until cut back to a size that made sense. Powers asked to be promoted. Refusal is a form of stewardship. The trick is a tool with a safety cover, not a crown. Evening hung its repetition of windows across the city without becoming redundant. I leaned my forehead to the pane and listened to the ghost of ticking that once irritated me and now visited like an old friend who understands the value of brief company. Somewhere a clock had ended. Somewhere a different one had begun. Between them, breath chose to continue. The corridor of my building painted me a path. The cat waited at the end with the composure of a gatekeeper. Food happened. Indifference greeted me, which is a cat's way of peace. I closed the door without rehearsal. Night offered a blank page. The watch rested on the table like a small moon stuck on one phase. The seam slept where it belonged, in the responsible portion of imagination. Morning returned with bread scent, the crispness of newsprint, and the low conversation of tires with wet streets. I laced shoes with care and not ceremony. I set out into hours I had not pre-approved. If somewhere ahead my palm found the seam, it would be pressed for life or harm reduced. Not for vanity, not for the fiction of a smoother self. 3 minutes were sufficient for mercy. The rest of time deserved the dignity of being itself. I left the city for a day and learned its absence by the change in air. Fields performed the geometry of patience. A canal skimmed clouds into strips thin enough to forget their height. At a roadside shrine, a bell waited for a rope to be taken seriously. I bowed without theology and listened to the echo care enough to return. The ground kept its promises, which is the best anyone can do. Back home, I found a crack in the stairwell wall I had not noticed. It grew the way ivy grows, pretending to be harmless while practicing persistence. Neighbors passed it without assigning meaning. I added it to my private collection of honest imperfections, markers that tell a building's story without asking for attention. If time were an artist, cracks would be its signature. I practiced the courtesy of slow mornings when work permitted. Tea leaves disclosed themselves at the pace of water. Sunlight took an interest in the edge of the sink. The cat insisted on architectural considerations before accepting a lap. Patience revealed itself as a muscle that forgives misuses if thanked for its service. A friend's absence unfolded over weeks, one unanswered message at a time. The seam in my palm offered a cheap circus trick and then remembered the rules. 3 minutes cannot repair what neglect takes from the future. I built a small ritual instead, a bench at dusk, a mental list of what had been good, a promise to remain receptive should the door open again. Waiting is a discipline different from rewinding. One respects time's spine, the other bends it. I learned the increments of courage that ordinary life demands. Return the wallet found in a puddle without inventing a script to receive thanks. Place a hand on a stranger's shoulder when collapse has already taken a first step, and accept that you are not the hero of that story. Only a hinge in a day that might have slammed. Write a small check. Sweep a hall. Wash a borrowed cup more carefully than your own. Courage dislikes showmanship. It keeps books in pencil. I made a list of rules I wanted to keep until I did not need lists. Use the gift when breaths are threatened. Resist the urge to edit for aesthetics or pride. Sit with discomfort without dressing it in explanations. Praise work done at ordinary speed. Allow scenes to end without agreeing to become souvenirs. Refuse the delusion of ownership over what time makes. Repair what can be repaired by hands. Feed the animal. Learn the names of those who share your walls. Memorize the routes fire trucks choose. Keep extra water. Apologize by action. Treat silence as a craft. Treat slowness as a teacher. On a day that smelled of diesel and oranges, a street performer missed a catch, then corrected it without magic. The crowd applauded practice. I applauded inside my pocket where my hand rested away from its old habit. The trick could have made the catch inevitable. The point was to respect the right of failure to teach a different class. I developed a fondness for bridges. They pretend weight is a rumor for long enough to change where people belong. Standing on one with a river practicing its same conversation beneath me. I understood why I had grown protective of Without it there is no crossing, only oscillation. Without it, a life is rehearsal without a premiere. A letter returned or did not. I learned that both outcomes leave the same responsibility behind. Kindness to the part of oneself that had the nerve to reach. I kept a chair ready for good news and refused to rent the second chair to despair. Waiting became less about what would happen and more about who I intended to be, while I did not know. I swept the stairwell on weekends no one had claimed. Dust learned my name. The crack in the wall lengthened by a breath. The building's breath and mine negotiated a rhythm that felt like cooperation. I understood at last why people bless houses. A house is the theater where time performs its quietest acts. A blackout emptied windows of their signatures. The city became a study in scale. Voices traveled farther. Footsteps grew louder. Stars resumed duties they had been outsourced from. I climbed to the roof and watched the horizon be honest. The antenna sang to itself. The watch on my wrist swung at small moonlight and kept its hands where they had been. I counted 3 heartbeats in the silence, not to open the seam, but to remember the covenant. Mercy when needed, restraint when not. Dawn climbed carefully through scaffolding. A bakery returned to the street the right to smell hopeful. I carried 2 loaves home and left one at a door that had recently learned grief. The gesture did not pretend to be medicine. It pretended to be bread and succeeded. I sat with the list again and found it shorter than before. The rules had moved from instruction to instinct. I had pressed the seam only when lives tilted, and I had paid for that press with a small, necessary exhaustion that reminded me of lifting furniture for a friend. There is pride available there, but it is better tasted alone. On the last morning of a year that had never promised anything, I set the watch on the window ledge and let sun find the crack. Dust gathered and made a galaxy on a very small scale. The city rehearsed fireworks that would arrive whether or not a person deserved them. I wrote one more line under my breath. If somewhere ahead my fingers find the seam, press softly and only for mercy. Then remove the hand and accept the shape the world chooses next. I put the watch back on and stepped into the corridor. The cat considered my existence and allowed it. The door clicked in a key that finally sounded like home. The day began, which is enough. And when evening arrived with its gentle aggressions of color and repetition, I returned the favor by being present and letting everything be irreversible, in the exact way it needed to be. I walked the river again, hands empty, pockets light, shoulders learning square from the inside. A barge rewrote the surface and forgot it at once. Lamps woke in sequence like carefully trained birds. High above, a plane stitched a line where no one would live. The city held its breath and let it go, as all cities must. The seam in my palm slept. The watch kept its lesson. 3 minutes were sufficient for mercy. The rest of time remained gloriously, obstinately itself, and I loved it enough to leave it alone. I carried the long day forward and let it stretch until it touched a border I had not visited. The border did not look like a line. It looked like habit reduced to its quiet bones, when the city allowed itself a day of rest that no one had scheduled. I followed a canal until warehouses sank into grasses, and grasses into the slow authority of water. Barges moved like patient handwriting. The sky distributed birds with the care of someone counting change. I tested the seam in my palm without pressing it, the way a violinist touches a string to find a harmonic, and then lifts the finger to let the air own the note. The refusal felt stronger than the trick. At home, the watch waited on the dresser without complaint. Dust gathered on the glass and made galaxies out of disinterest. I learned to polish it with the same cadence each week so that repetition could become a form of thanks. Routine makes a shelter out of ordinary things. A person cannot live in crisis and remain someone others can approach. The cat declared seniority over the balcony and extended jurisdiction to the windowsill. It slept in the sun as if sleep had been its idea. I filled bowls and removed bowls and accepted the small tyranny. Animals know how to train people without insulting them. That is a talent I lack and do not plan to learn. Work preferred exactness to heroics. Spreadsheets asked for numbers that behaved. I became reliable the way a chair is reliable, not glamorous, but missed when absent. Colleagues treated my calm as if it had always been mine. Calm is not a gift. It is a habit you pay for in small installments. I kept paying. When the seam in my palm twitched, it was almost always for bought. A ladle of boiling stock tipped toward a wrist in a restaurant kitchen, and the cook never knew that a burn had been replaced by a tidy near miss. A truck drifted too close to a bicycle, and a new lane appeared a heartbeat earlier than it had before. A toddler leaned into a fountain and discovered the seriousness of wet without the insult of panic. I left quickly when I could. The gratitude I wanted was the kind that never learned my name. A winter market set up in the square and taught lights to be warm again. Steam from sweet buns rewrote the air into a language even strangers agreed to speak. I practiced standing in lines without editing them. I let impatience salt my tongue and dissolve. The trick made a dull weight at the base of my thumb and then went quiet. I understood that powers, like children, behave better when they are not the theme of the day. The old clock shop remained closed, but winter found a way to return its sound. A neighbor repaired a metronome and left it near an open window. The measured click lifted down the street and stitched corners into a common tempo. I walked past and adopted the pace without comment. There is dignity in being one pedestrian among many, with no private choreography to obey. On a morning iced thin with light, I visited a high hill that belonged to runners at dawn and couples at dusk. The path was honest. It demanded a steady foot and rewarded attention with views that did not brag. From the top, the city resembled a patient board game. Trains slid across squares of certainty. A river practiced its one sentence and did not apologize for repeating it. A hawk used a thermal until it looked like a moving comma. I considered opening the seam just to watch the hawk redraw its circle and felt how petty that would be. Respect means allowing the world to improvise without your edit. A storm discovered the city's name late in the season. Rain arrived with a seriousness that asked streets to confess how poorly they had been designed. Drains learned humility. People learned new routes. In the underpass near the stadium, water collected where feet had expected floor. I waited until my knees debated, and then I turned back, which was the correct lesson. At the far end, a hand waved, not for me specifically, but for help in general. And I let the seam small in time to the precise instant where a shoulder could be a step. We reached the stairs one version earlier than the version that would have required an apology none of us had time to make. The difference between almost and after is thin, but real. I started to volunteer at places that needed patience more than solutions. Shelves of food asked to be arranged so that tomorrow could be kind to today. Boxers wanted labels that would not peel in a hurry. A quiet office used by people who keep people safe learned the weight of my handwriting on sign-in sheets. I became a small part of other people's routines. The seam stayed asleep in those rooms, which felt like proof I had chosen correctly. In the middle of a week that tasted like metal, the city shook in a way no forecast had considered. It was not an earthquake with headlines. It was the smaller kind, the private kind, that belongs to one building at a time. Pipes remembered their ancestors and coughed. An old beam considered retirement the way tired knees consider stairs. I reached a stairwell and felt the banister argue with its bracket. The seam in my palm behaved as if it had been waiting to be useful. I chose 3 heartbeats well and avoided a break I would have misnamed as bad luck. The building settled and decided to remain a building. I made tea for the neighbor, who had not yet learned to vibrate slower after fear. I listened to the clink of the spoon in the mug and treated it like a drummer, counting in a gentler song. I noticed patterns that did not need power to be valuable. Supermarkets put oranges at the front when the sky darkened early. A small defiance of seasonal logic that still worked on the brain. Crosswalks clicked their signals with the same personality from one neighborhood to the next, teaching travelers a dialect that required no teacher. Bridges hummed when trucks crossed them, and hummed differently when the river was low, as if the chords had more room. I collected these sounds the way some people collect stamps. None of them asked for edits. The watch picked up a second scratch, then a third. The face looked like a tiny planet with tectonic plates. I considered replacing it and decided to keep the damage. It explained me to myself without needing a story. The band developed a crease shaped like my wrist. Tools that fit are a record. Spring rehearsed and then took the stage. The city smelled like soil and apology. People stepped into parks as if the grass had written invitations. I carried a book I did not read and sat where the wind could proofread my hair. A dog decided a stick was an emergency and solved it with the only method it knows. Children discovered velocity. I let the day go by without prodding it. And the absence of interference felt like a skill. A friend of a-friend lost a job and asked without asking for help finding a smaller apartment. I lifted boxes and listened to a silence that knew it had been cheated of an argument. I walked with a mattress leaning on the top of my head and felt ridiculous in a way that makes pride redundant. Late afternoon found us on a balcony that did not yet belong to anyone. We watched clouds rehearsing the courage to rain and pretended the air was enough for now. I returned home and realized I had gone a whole day without wondering where the seam was. That is a metric I keep. On a different day, a cyclist fell in front of me and invented a radius of strangers who turned into a team. I pressed a towel into a hand that had misjudged gravel and let someone else use authority in their voice. The seam remained a theory because cooperation is stronger than magic. I added the towel to the list of things that had earned a retirement ceremony. I took a train to the ocean, as if the decision had been waiting in my pocket for months. The platform smelled like iron and oranges again. The carriage wore the easy fatigue of old upholstery. I sat where the aisle could tutor my patience and watched fields replace backyards with the logic of a map. The ocean performed its constant role, a body too large to notice me, but polite enough to allow me to watch. I walked the tide line and let one wave take the footprint of the next until my steps belonged to no one. I kept my hands away from the seam and practiced the risk of irreversible horizons. The practice made me more human than any edit ever had. When I returned, the city had perfected a season while I was gone. Restaurants had decided to widen their shoulders onto the pavement. Bicycles had multiplied like clever rabbits. A mural had appeared on a wall that used to pretend it belonged to no one. The mural displayed a clock with hands removed and replaced by birds. The birds were mid-flight and yet pinned to paint. I stood there longer than a stranger should, and felt the old jealousy of artists who do not need my trick to defeat time. I went home and set the watch on the table with careful respect. A power outage found us on a hot night and reminded a whole street what bodies sound like when they are not protecting their secrets with walls of noise. Laughter traveled farther. Arguments shrank out of embarrassment. The cat took the center of the floor and invented a new posture for heat. I carried water up the stairs for the one neighbor whose knees hate darkness and decided to remain awake until the city resumed, pretending it does not need anyone. When light returned, it felt like applause. I kept a private notebook for rules I intended to forget, only after they had become permanent. Use the seam for breath, for harm reduced, for kindness multiplied, never for vanity, never for pride, never for convenience, never to create beauty that would have grown on its own. The list was longer when I was younger. Age edits lists, which is the only kind of editing I now practice without guilt. Summer let itself be lazy, and I learned to lie on the floor and treat a ceiling as a novel. Paint held the history of the building in uneven whites. Hairline cracks offered an atlas. I traced borders with my eyes until I could hear the stories without pressing for a better version. The ceiling taught me not to improve what is already informative. A small festival took the street by surprise and converted traffic into choreography. Banners hung between windows that did not know they would make friends. The air changed flavors every 10 steps. I moved through the density and let the crowd instruct my shoulders on the skill of yielding. The seam in my palm buzzed a little under the overload and then calmed. As if the sheer number of choices made the chance of intervention absurd. The best protection against misuse is abundance handled with care. I visited the cemetery on a day no one else had chosen. The paths respected the feet of the old and the slow. Names competed for shade. The city's noise stepped back and left a thin layer of quiet over everything. I walked without counting and practiced the dignified tenderness of reading stone. The seam could do nothing here and should do nothing. Mercy belongs to the living. Respect belongs to both. In late summer, the city held a heat that felt like a chore. I interrupted work with a walk to a public fountain and let the spray rewrite my posture. Children claimed the plaza with the democracy of wetness. I sat on the steps and performed the rare trick of having no agenda. The seam slept. The watch reflected a thin cloud and claimed it as a decoration. Every object enjoyed being useless for a moment. Uselessness is rest. A call for blood donors appeared in the lobby of my building, printed on a sheet that had learned humility from the photocopier. I walked to the address and let a stranger turn my arm into cooperation. I watched a bag fill with a color the brain pretends to ignore. I had nothing to fix. I had only an ounce of time to give away. Giving is practice for letting the world own part of you without returning it in your preferred shape. On a day that borrowed a sky from colder months, a tremor ran through the neighborhood again, this one wider and less polite. The rhythm of the street learned an arrhythmia. Windows objected. Shelves confessed to poor decisions. The seam leaped awake like a friend who keeps a packed bag by the door. I kept my uses inside the ledger I had written in my bones. A hand caught before a fall, a shoulder guided away from a shower of cheap glass. A door wedged open one heartbeat earlier to keep a stairwell democratic. I did not correct misaligned picture frames. I did not rescue decorative bowl collections. I rescued ankles and elbows, and the one old dog who can still panic without moving afterward. I swept shards with neighbors who pretended not to be shaken. We exchanged nods that understood the bargain of living where ground occasionally remembers that sky is not the only thing allowed to move. I boiled water in the quiet and listened to its insistence. Boiling water is proof that the present is doing its job. The season turned again and scribbled color in the margins where trees thought they would be allowed to stay green forever. I walked streets that were learning to tolerate early darkness and found myself stopping at the old clock shop out of habit. The door was still locked. The window held only dust. I cupped my hands against the glass and accepted the lesson of opacity. Not every closed thing is a mystery asking to be solved. Some of them are simply closed. A new cafe opened nearby and served drinks in cups that committed to their weight. The owner believed in wooden chairs that refused to wobble. I wrote in a corner and discovered that a pen can be a metronome when the heart has earned a quieter tempo. I kept my watch on the table where light could include it in whatever performance it had planned for the morning. Broken hands can still be beautiful if they agree to be honest. I began to teach myself small repairs, stitching that never intended to be seen, glue that accepted invisibility as success, screws that learned to trust the torque of my wrist. The world thanked me by not falling apart in ways that demanded drama. I learned a respect for tools that made noise only when using them wrong. A deluge in late autumn forced the river to argue with its banks. The city accepted temporary borders and apologized with detours. I stood on a bridge and measured how narrow the line is between spectacle and harm. The seam ticked under my skin like a reminder rather than a suggestion. I pressed once for a dog at the edge of panic, once for a cyclist inventing a bad choice, and once for a stranger who did not understand that water collects where familiarity tells you it will not. 3 uses, exact and small. The river kept the rest of its lesson. I went home soaked and tired in a way that pays for itself. Winter again, breath visible, then briefly theatrical. Shops argued with the cold by adding cinnamon to the air. I wrapped the watch band tighter and felt the crease greet my pulse like an old colleague. I kept the list short and the kettle honest. I let mornings expand when they decided to, and shortened evenings by turning lights off earlier than pride would prefer. Rest is an edit that needs no seam. An old photograph surfaced from a drawer I had lost interest in. It showed a version of me that belonged to a room with different curtains and a plant I had since admitted defeat to. I studied the posture I used to trust and felt both affection and impatience. I could have pressed the seam and chased that body back into the present. I chose instead to accept the shape the day had given me. Nostalgia is an editor with a bad ear for dialogue. Silence served me better. I visited the ocean again in a month that did not encourage that sort of trip. The water was steel. The sky was academic. I watched a lone figure practice running as if distance were a prayer. My hands stayed neutral. The tide took what it was owed and paid back something like clarity. I returned with pockets of sand and a sense that the world would continue without my advice. The new year arrived, with the kind of snow that teaches rooftops manners. The streets slowed to the speed of systems that remember kindness. I shoveled not only my piece of sidewalk, but the piece to either side, and no one saw it happen, which made it more valuable to me. In the afternoon, neighbors walked as if the city had been improved, without their having to approve the budget. That is a good trick, and it requires no seam. A notice appeared about a community preparedness class. I hesitated, and then signed my name with the handwriting I use when I want to be trustworthy. The class taught the psychology of panic and the physics of doors. It taught how to speak from the back of your throat when air is full of smoke. It taught where to stack bottled water and which batteries forgive ignorance. It never once mentioned miracles. I learned to appreciate disciplines that would pass any audit. I practiced a kind of meditation that involved naming sounds instead of ignoring them. Footsteps overhead, radiator click, a bus releasing its knees, the elevator cable reporting in, the kettle deciding, the cat deciding against deciding. The practice made the seam quieter. The watch watched me without opinion. In the middle of a day that meant nothing to anyone else, I missed my train again and sat with the impatience until it stopped pretending to be useful. I ate the useful kind of bread from a paper bag. I let a crumb collection grow on my coat. The next train arrived and accepted me without ceremony. I began to prefer graceless acceptances to graceful arrangements. I rearranged the apartment to better fit the way I actually lived, rather than the way I had intended to live. One chair left. A table moved closer to the window that remembers sunsets. I made a corner for shoes and another for apologies. The seam in my palm approved by doing nothing. Architecture is a promise you write to your own bones. I received news that wanted to change my posture and allowed it to change my posture. I made tea. I stood at the sink and let steam add a layer to the air. I wrote a note on a small piece of paper and placed it where my hand would find it when my head forgot. The note did not ask time to bend. It asked me to remember how to stand. This is still my best use of paper. When fatigue sharpened into a noise, I took the hill again and allowed the path to negotiate with my breath. I refused the temptation to count laps. I stopped where the bench had learned every winter, and let the city be statistics from far away. A train taught the air, a low vow. The river abided. I put my hand on the watch, and discovered I was not checking it. I was thanking it for failing to move. A series of small storms stitched themselves into a season. The city accepted and improvised. Balconies learned to tie their laundry differently. Shops learned to light their doorways earlier. People improved at looking up. In the repetition, I found room for new patience. Patience moved like a neighbor who had always lived next door but rarely waved. We nodded more often. A letter arrived that had taken a long route. It contained the shape of something like closure without being theatrical about it. I placed it on the table and allowed sunlight to grade the tone of the paper. I read it twice and then placed it with the receipts that prove a life's small economies. The seam in my palm felt like an old book's spine, flexible and loyal. I had not needed it to manufacture this moment. That made the moment larger. On a spring night that refused wind, I stood on the roof and watched satellites perform their neat cruelties. The antenna sang the way it had since before I learned the trick. I thought of all the uses I had not allowed myself and felt the ache of them wink and fade. Restraint leaves a residue that tastes like dignity if you let it sit long enough. I went inside and set the watch by the bed. The cat made a circle and became sleep. The building sighed as pipes learned the next song. I lay flat and counted 3 heartbeats, not to open the seam, but to honor the distance between mercy and control. Then I stopped counting and let the world carry its own weight. The night did not need my help, being night. Morning found me before alarms made their case. I made the quiet coffee, the kind that understands neighbors. I rolled the rug back and repaired a small rip with thread that had waited patiently for months. I checked the batteries in the flashlight and the dates on the water jugs and the whereabouts of the spare keys. I pressed my palm flat on the door and taught my bones to remember the feel of leaving without rehearsal. The day, once again, began. I stepped into it without asking for revisions. If somewhere ahead the seam asks to be used, I will press it as lightly as possible, and only for breath, only for harm made smaller, only for kindness that cannot learn itself in any other way. Everything else belongs to time. Time has earned that right. I have learned how to agree. I treated the new season as a ledger that did not owe me clarity. Trees rehearsed softness until streets learned to speak in green. I carried the watch like a small, stubborn moon and let mornings decide their own mathematics. The seam in my palm slept most days and dreamed of being unnecessary. I cheered for its sleep by keeping my hands busy with ordinary repairs and my eyes loyal to distances that refused to be shortened. A notice appeared about a training on river safety, held in a bright room, shaped like an apology for floods. I sat in a chair that forgave fidgeting and learned how water punishes certainties. The instructor moved with the patience of someone who has stood in currents and survived. I memorized ropes and knots, and the way a body turns when cold teaches it a new rule. None of it asked for miracles. All of it asked for practice. I carried the practice home and coiled it beside the door, where umbrellas used to pretend to be enough. The cat aged in dignified increments. It surrendered leaps it could no longer perform and requested steps be moved closer to favorite altitudes. I adjusted shelves and furniture without inventing symbolism. Accommodation is a cousin of love that prefers not to be thanked. I learned to nap on purpose, supervised by a creature that had made sleep into governance. Work thickened briefly, the way soup does when heat and time stop arguing. I moved through tasks with attention paid to commas and column widths and the narrow bridges numbers must cross. Colleagues stopped asking whether I could meet a deadline because my history had begun to answer in advance. Reliability writes its own introduction. I added a line to my private rules that said competence is a daily romance, not a scene. During a storm, a billboard surrendered a metal panel to wind. It did not know it was sharp. It leaped and slid and struck sparks where it kissed the street. I stood under an awning with strangers who practiced concern without needing permission. The seam twitched once, twice, a third time, and I used it for feet that did not see the moving sheet. For a cyclist learning too late the difference between hazard and spectacle. For a dog whose leash taught it a circle that would have ended badly. The panel clanged into a parked truck, and the storm rehearsed being louder. We dispersed with the kind of relief that prefers not to be discussed. I replaced the awning with rain and walked home convinced that mercy is lattice inside the person who gives it and need not be heard outside at all. Returned to the museum and let a new exhibition, Shine Polite Light, on night. Photographs presented bodies in motion, frozen to the point where velocity translated into tenderness. I stood in front of a frame in which a diver had just left the board, spine curved like punctuation, toes pointing at the exact spot the body would not occupy a heartbeat later. I felt the seam lift and settle, an unnecessary reflex, indulged, then dismissed. And I thanked the photographer for catching a version of mercy that did not require intervention. A friend moved into a building that had known storms and learned from them. The stairwells carried the smell of clean concrete, a civic cologne. I helped install a bookshelf made from wood with a past, and we discovered that the wall had learned the language of almost plumb. We shimmed and respected and made a compromise a person could live with. I returned home with a splinter and the contentment that comes from letting imperfection earn the rent. Late one evening, the city practiced a blackout for real. Elevators chose humility, streetlights took a vow of silence, and windows learned to project candlelight like small saints. I went to the roof with a thermos and listened for the noise of relief inside the quiet. Stars performed an inventory of themselves. A neighbor hummed a lullaby designed for no one. Somewhere a generator made a low vow to continue. The seam remained asleep. The watch reflected a constellation it could not name and did not need to. The river bit at its banks again, angrier than last time, and I used skills from the training room with a seriousness they had earned. Ropes found reasons to exist. Hands learned the friction that keeps a body safe without testing dignity. The seam opened 3 measured times for a ladder that hesitated, for a foot that chose the wrong tile, for an old shoulder that needed a margin it had not asked for. Afterward, I bundled towels into bags and carried them like warm proof that the present knows how to care for itself. Exhaustion taught me a gentler gait and sent me to sleep with a gratitude that did not require adjectives. Spring turned into the kind of summer that forgives poor planning. I kept water by doors and pockets. I learned the shade each block could offer at different hours. I slowed to the pace that lets plants explain themselves. Basil taught me how greed ruins flavor. Rosemary taught me that time and time are different words for similar patience. I cooked for neighbors and left bowls covered with plates that remembered other meals. Feeding people is an argument for belonging that does not require a verdict. Asterisk, asterisk, A. Stranger collapsed near the market, and the crowd learned the choreography that chaos demands. Space opened. A phone found a hand that already knew the number to dial. I kept a shoulder between the body and the bright attention of cameras. The seam did not open because the seconds would not have mattered inside that kind of crisis. Instead, I held a shade against the sun and counted breaths that did not owe me anything. When help arrived, I stepped back and swallowed the urge to invent meaning. Some days you are simply a bridge between an event and the people designed to meet it. At home, I added ice to a bowl for the cat and let my own bones memorize the cool. I placed the watch in the refrigerator by accident and laughed at the picture of time, asking to be chilled. I retrieved it, dried it, and noticed a new line in the crack, a fault line adjusting its empire. Impermanence enjoys a sense of humor. An invitation arrived to speak to a class about preparedness. I do not teach, but I sat in the back of a room that smelled like dry markers and recited my rules without their poetry. People wrote down the parts that matched their own maps. I showed them the contents of a bag that looks like an ordinary tote and apologized for its weight. Objects passed from hand to hand: batteries, bandages, a whistle, water, stubborn snacks that keep their promises. I did not mention the seam. Not everything is a resource meant for distribution. Some things are a discipline meant for stewardship. On a walk that turned into a small pilgrimage, I found the old clock shop open. A new owner had wiped the windows and returned sound to the street. The faces on the wall kept different tempers, but agreed on civility. I stood amid the tick and talk and felt a private ceremony complete itself. I did not buy a clock. I bought oil for a hinge I had been ignoring, and a brush meant to persuade dust into gentleness. The owner wrapped them with the care reserved for gifts and handed them back to a stranger, who looked like he had learned at least one long lesson. A letter arrived from the person I had once written to. It was neither an apology nor a claim. It was a weather report written by someone who had finally learned her own climate. I read it at the table, where sunlight likes to commit small crimes. I folded it twice, placed it where important ordinary things live, and felt the seam, for once, open not to time, but to patience. Some replies do not change anything except the angle of the room. Changing the angle is enough. I developed a habit of sitting in lobbies and letting buildings teach me their syntax. Patterns declared themselves. People gravitated to particular chairs because light forgave faces there. Security guards conducted symphonies of nods. Elevators confessed to favoritism. One afternoon a plant fell from a too-high ledge that resented its placement, and I moved a hand by instinct without taking a heartbeat from anyone. Soil learned the floor, and the floor learned to accept soil. A janitor thanked gravity for giving him something clear to do. I admired how competence makes gratitude unnecessary. On a cold morning I found an abandoned bike frame chained to a sign that had forgotten why it mattered. Rust performed its slow theater. I wanted to free the frame, and could not. Instead, I returned with a bright ribbon and tied it to the top tube. I gave the ribbon a private rule. If the ribbon fades to white, let the frame go. Weeks later, the ribbon told me the decision had been made, and the city followed suit with a truck that didn't need my blessing. I repaired a step in the building that had learned to protest. Under the weight of groceries, the repair held and became invisible, as repairs should. I placed a note where the superintendent would find it, signed with the neutral handwriting I use when I want credit to land in the ledger of the place rather than in mine. Buildings keep better books than people do, eh? Child in the courtyard learned to throw and taught me how far arcs can travel when intention and laughter agree. I stood in the shade and counted catches. The seam refused to open for misses because practice had claimed the right to be sovereign here. I kept score internally and discarded it when the lesson concluded. Numbers are a comfort that sometimes interfere with truth. Deep summer asked for fevers and offered cicadas in exchange. I lay on the floor and let sweat do the thinking. The cat appointed itself nurse by occupying the square of air my body considered vital. I surrendered my calendar to an afternoon that enjoyed being useless. Work forgave me, and the world refused to notice the absence, which is how you know the world is healthy. On the first day, the air hinted at autumn. I climbed the hill and carried a coil of rope just in case habit wanted a prop. The path did not test me. The bench remembered every posture I had ever brought it. The city's grid blurred into a patience I had not always possessed. I tracked a hawk until the sky lost it, and then pretended the bird had decided to. Forgive me for earlier thoughts about editing its circles. Forgiveness is available when you already have no intention of asking for it. I pressed my palm to the watch and felt the slight ridge where crack meets edge and decided to keep it, to refuse the smooth replacement that would lie about who I had been. I walked down through a park that produced a friend from under a sycamore with the politeness of someone about to leave town. We did not promise anything. We exchanged schedules that would fail to intersect and accepted it without grief. Some goodbyes are an agreement to preserve the quality of what has already been shared, rather than to negotiate installments of new quality under poor conditions. At home, I wrote the season's shorter list. Use the seam when a breath is about to lose its argument, for harm made small, for kindness that cannot otherwise be taught. Refuse it for beauty, for pride, for convenience, for envy disguised as care, for nostalgia that sells counterfeit currency. Keep water, keep rope, keep patience, keep chairs where tired people will find them without asking. Keep a small stash of humor accessible to strangers. The year folded again, and the city let itself be draped with lights and expectations. I set none, and received what arrived, as if it had been commissioned. Fireworks rehearsed, then performed. On the roof, the antenna sang an old song it had learned from lightning. I counted 3 heartbeats, and did not press. The watch kept its silence. The seam kept its dignity. The night kept its job. I went inside and left the door ajar, a moment longer than necessary in case the cat preferred a different opinion about the future. The cat kept the current opinion. I closed the door and sat on the floor where the grain of wood remembered trees and the varnish remembered hands. I felt the weight of the day in my knees and blessed the fact that weight exists. I fell asleep without bargaining. Morning unscrolled with the confidence of a road already paid for. I boiled water and poured it over leaves that now trusted me to be patient. I mended a shirt at the table in stitches small enough to count only if you cared. I placed the watch on my wrist and accepted the lesson it refused to stop teaching. I left the apartment and let the hallway decide the speed of my steps. The city cleared its throat and spoke in the language of errands. If somewhere ahead the seam should wake, I will let it wake for breath, for harm reduced, for kindness multiplied, and then I will let it sleep again. Everything else belongs to time. Time is not perfect, and does not need to be. It needs witnesses who understand the difference between improvement and interference. I am learning to be that witness, one unedited step at a time. I treated the tilt of the year as an instrument I was still learning. Autumn practiced restraint, winter rehearsed declaration. I carried the watch like a small oath and kept my palm disciplined, using the seam only where breath stood at a ledge. The rest I left to the slow democratic labor of days. A community center near the river opened its doors at night for people the city missed. I learned the taxonomy of blankets and the difference between warmth and heat. I learned to brew tea that forgave impatience and to cut fruit the way a tired body can trust. The floor had its own climate. The doors remembered names faster than volunteers did. I wiped tables, rolled cots into rectangles, labeled bins until the markers began to smell like routine. The seam slept in those hours because care already knew how to bend time with attention on mornings afterward. The world tasted like boiled water, cooled just right. My hands kept the memory of cotton and the honest weight of folded fabric. I walked home along streets that remembered night's work and let them tell me where the city keeps its kindness. A bakery opened early so the scent could lead shifts to their posts. A bus driver waved at no one and everyone. A courier balanced expertly between lanes of waking obligation. I watched these systems coexist and took notes on humility. When the first proper snow arrived, rooftops learned caution. Balconies acquired edges sharper than the eye remembered. I sanded a handrail in my stairwell where condensation had begun to argue with paint. The watch braced my wrist with the minimal authority of habit. I tightened a loose hinge, the one that had made a door confess irritation each evening. Tools persuaded wood into agreement, a negotiation that cost no pride and prevented injuries I would never see. Prevention is the quiet twin of rescue. I visited a harbor that stores summer and winter as memory. Boats wore covers like thoughts wrapped for later. Ropes remembered knots, the way hands remember promises. A gull practiced the dignity of solitary flight. The water considered ice and decided against it for now. I traced the curve of a rusted bollard and respected the sentence it tells. 1,000 pulls, 1,000 releases, no speeches. I left with gloved hands that smelled lightly of salt, a scent that convinces the lungs they have been honest today. In an old market, a camera found me by pretending to be broken. Its leather had been taught history by sun. Its lens wore a scratch not unlike the watch. I bought it, not to make time behave, but to let light accumulate in small rectangles that tell the truth badly, and therefore well. I began to walk with film in my pocket, learning the temper of grain, choosing slowness on purpose. The camera taught me to ask for permission from light rather than from hours. Frames do not rewind. They either exist or they don't. That is a mercy disguised as a rule. I taught myself to make a small radio work again. Wires learned roots. A dial remembered etiquette. In the evening, I let it pull voices out of air and line them up inside the room, like visitors who know how long to stay. Baseball results muttered into jazz. Weather turned into poetry by distance. Foreign news arrived wearing a reasonable coat. I tuned until a station found me, rather than the other way around. The cat learned to sleep to frequencies that forgive snoring. The seam, for once, felt older than the radio and behaved accordingly. On the hill path, frost patterned leaves with a discipline I admired. My breath borrowed the manners of clouds. Runners passed with the gravity of planets testing new orbits. I sat on the bench that keeps all confidences and considered how often I had used the seam for small bravado before. I learned the advantage of restraint. From here, the grid of the city looked less like control and more like a promise to meet. Again and again, where a bridge says so. A letter arrived from a different friend. The kind of friend who writes as if sentences can build scaffolding around a hard month. I read it slowly and did not try to own the role of solver. I sent back a map of what had helped me when my own weeks clogged. Bread, water, a seat near daylight, a list of names to text with no need for replies, a rule that forbids decisions after midnight. I wrote it by hand because I trusted the friction of pen on paper to pass along some portion of my steadiness. The seam stayed asleep. The envelope closed with a firm, unmagical click. News traveled poorly one afternoon, and a neighbor left the building in a shape that asked the stairwell to remember. I carried a plant for the family when they returned with more quiet than anyone knows what to do with. The plant did not intend to be symbolic. It only knew how to continue converting light into use. I watered it when asked, and otherwise worked at leaving space unedited for grief to breathe at its own rate. The seam can do nothing here. The watch sat like a respectful witness. Spring loosened pipes and language. I cleared a closet with a decisiveness that had been on back. Objects insisted on the stories I had attached to them. I negotiated new endings where necessary, and let others retire to the thrift shop that makes luck for strangers. The camera learned a new strap. The radio claimed a shelf that understands weight. A set of chipped cups went to people who like to drink outside and do not mind teaching porcelain how to forgive. Weather. I took the long train to a town that only sells patience. Mountains stored winter where summer cannot reach it. The platform wore the quiet authority of altitude. I hiked until air convinced my heart to respect distances I had underpriced. Snowmelt wrote, cursive across rock. An old hut kept a guest book that prized bad pens over good prose. I added my name not as a performance, but as a participation fee. Below a ridge, I met a field of alpine flowers that had no interest in being memorable, and therefore were. I returned to the station with the kind of humility that makes hunger taste like gratitude. Back home, a storm practiced staging without hurting anyone. The sky rehearsed with light, like a conductor explaining downbeats. I sat on the roof while the antenna sang its stubborn hymn, and let the spectacle run through me without needing proof. Lightning should never be edited. Thunder belongs to the gut. I learned the names of the night staff on our street. The person who washes glass out of the gutter, so tires can pretend luck. The person who resets traffic cones, so morning's choreography can succeed. The person who tests locks with a care that understands objects will lie, if not asked twice. I learned to say thank you in the grammar of stepping aside, in the cadence of not interrupting, in the smaller art of leaving a thermos on a stoop and not checking whether it is found. Not all acknowledgments need witnesses. In late spring, a child lost a kite to a tree and found a way to be proud anyway. I watched from a bench as the line tangled and the fabric became a flag for the season. The seam twitched and I refused it, then picked up a long branch and, with 2 other strangers, convinced the tree to approve the release. The kite returned more leaf than air, and the child accepted it as a story. Cooperation outperformed magic again, as it usually does. Work delivered a problem with too many moving parts, and I solved it not with speed, but with polite pressure applied at a dozen small pivots. I left the solution visible enough that the next person could trace it without my voice. I marked the handoff with a note so plain it looked inevitable. The seam is not the only way to remove friction. Sometimes the right tool is time multiplied by several people who stop trying to be impressive. Asterisk, asterisk, A. Festival arrived that trusted lanterns more than microphones. Light moved, like breath, across an evening that had agreed to be generous. I walked the river and took 1 photograph every 100 steps, accepting whatever the frame offered without bargaining. Later, the prince taught me that the city loves angles. My eyes refuse, out of habit. I pinned a few to the wall, and let them adjust the room's temperament. Rooms learn if you let them. A day came that asked everything at once. A fallen ladder, a spilled pot in a shop, a cyclist clipped by a mirror and left wobbling, a lost person who needed a corner turned into an address, a dog that did not understand cars. I used the seam 3 times for bodies, and not once for convenience. I used my voice for the rest. I used my legs and my hands, and the sort of kindness that makes instructions sound like invitations. By night my bones had learned the fatigue that earned sleep honestly. I took it on a Sunday, so quiet it felt pre-approved. I oiled hinges in the building, and the doors stopped announcing themselves. Silence arrived, not as absence, but as readiness. The radio found an old song that knew how to step lightly over regret, without pretending regret had no weight. I set a loaf to rise, and watched the clock without asking it to move. The cat performed quality control on the patch of sun that belonged to nobody. I opened a window and let weather proofread the room. I walked to the harbor at dusk and saw a ship leave at a pace that taught patience to the observers. Lines released one by one. A horn said the single word it knows, and the word carried permission rather than power. I thought of all the moments I had not edited back into a cleaner version and felt the pride of a mason who leaves the right stone uncut. Roughness preserves grip. At the library, a child pored over an atlas and taught his finger the geometry of borders. I returned the camera to my eye and took a single frame of concentration so pure it did not need my approval. Later, developing the shot, I watched grain make a cathedral out of patience. Film lies in a useful way. It translates failure into texture. I taped the photo near the door as a reminder that effort and grace are cousins. Summer practiced, thunderstorms and forgiveness. I learned to cook in heat without starting arguments between pan and oil. Neighbors shared fruit that could not survive another day. I placed bowls on the railing for birds and watched a hierarchy settle without violence. Thirst as a small treaty. The seam stirred once when a window's edge met a wrist, and I spent the edit on skin instead of glass. Blood has a better argument than pains. A letter from the river authority invited volunteers to a drill. I arrived with rope and practical shoes and let professionals teach my body where to stand. We repeated motions until boredom became safety. We learned how to narrate calmly and how to make the voice find the back of the throat when smoke insists on knocking. I went home with tired calves and a new respect for verbs that keep their promises. Lift, brace, breathe, wait, carry, stop. I reorganized the apartment one more time, not for novelty, but for hospitality to future tiredness. A chair near the door acquired a legitimate purpose. Accept bags, forgive weight. Hooks learned the geometry of coats and gratitude. The radio's cord found a safer route. I stored water and food where hands will remember. I placed the flashlight where common sense will look first. I wrote a list that a stranger could read without knowing me. Planning is a quiet love letter to whoever might need you later, even if it's you. On a night when fog turned the city into memory, I walked the bridge and let lamps soften into halos. A ship's light moved across the water like a thought committed to its ending. I placed my palm on the rail and felt steel conduct the day's heat back into the air. The watch reflected amber circles and a smudge that refused to belong to any lamp. I counted 3 heartbeats out of habit and did not press. Mercy, it turns out, is larger when it is not asked to be constant. I slept with the window cracked to let a different temperature teach me a simpler lesson. In the small hours a rain began that respected rooftops and shushed alleys into listening. I dreamed of stairwells and rails that never gave way, of ladders that learned humility, of bridges that forgave traffic. I woke with gratitude that did not seek a target. I brewed the morning into existence and let the cup cool as slowly as it wanted. The cat approved by pretending disinterest. Day by day, the ledger filled with small equilibria. A child's shoelace tied on the first attempt. A door caught before a draft could slam pride into annoyance. A bus arriving late enough to teach patience, but early enough to protect plans. A photograph that refused to be good, and therefore became true. A letter answered without improving anyone's reputation. A rope coiled correctly, so that a future version of the day would feel seen. I kept the seam reserved for breath, for harm reduced, for kindness multiplied. Everything else I granted to time, which is to say I granted it to the only artist that knows how to finish. If somewhere ahead my fingers find that hidden place again, I will press exactly as lightly as a promise requires and lift away as quickly as respect demands. The watch will keep its lesson. The antenna will keep its song. The city will keep its noisy, ordinary mercy. I will keep walking at the speed that lets meaning find me without being chased. I carried the watch into the reopened clock shop and asked for nothing more than honesty. The case kept its scratch. The crystal kept its small fracture. The movement learned to breathe again. When the hands began to travel, the seam in my palm did not protest. Time resumed the modest work it had always done without me. I wore the watch out, into a late afternoon that smelled like bread and rain. Buses practiced their patience. Bicycles rehearsed their impatience. And the river argued with light in a language that needed no interpreter. I let a coin slip from my pocket and watched it spin, wobble, choose a side, and settle. The urge to lift the moment faded before it reached my fingers. I bent, picked up the coin, and kept walking. On the hill, the bench remembered my weight. The city organized itself into slow geometry. Trains as commas, bridges as sentences, rooftops as clauses that had finally learned where to end. I counted 3 heartbeats and felt nothing open except the ordinary dignity of breath continuing. Mercy did not need to be performed. Respect did not need to be announced. At home, I placed a bowl of water for the cat and a coil of rope by the door. The radio found a clear station without being asked twice. The apartment held its new arrangement the way a good sentence holds meaning, quietly, without calling attention to its own grammar. I set the watch on the table and let sunlight mark it with a moving square. The hands passed the old hour without ceremony. When the phone buzzed with a small request and the hallway filled with someone else's hurry, I went, and the seam stayed where it belonged, unimportant, obedient to the hierarchy I had chosen. A door needed lifting back onto its track. A shoulder needed the brief lesson of a steady palm. Nothing required an edit. Everything required presence. Night gathered without speeches. The antenna on the roof sang its rusted song. The city lit itself in responsible portions. Clouds rehearsed a storm and then changed their minds. I turned the watch toward my pulse and listened to 2 rhythms agreeing. The first cup, the lantern over the river, the bicycle at the rails, the letters that found their addresses, the rooms that learned silence, the bridges that forgave traffic. All of it arranged itself into a spine sturdy enough to carry tomorrow. If somewhere a headbreath leans over a ledge, I will press as lightly as necessary and lift my hand as soon as decency permits. If not, I will let the hands travel and the day proceed without rehearsal. 3 minutes were always enough for mercy. The rest belongs to time, and I belong to it.